It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And as always, some very smart talk radio is in your future. In this segment, we are extremely pleased to have a very, very talented, prolific author, Michael Korda, with us with an important new work called Alone, Britain, Churchill, and Dunkirk, Defeat into Victory. Michael Korda is the best-selling author of Hero, Clouds of Glory, and Charmed Lives, in addition to many other works. He's a former editor-in-chief of Simon & Schuster, and was awarded the Order of Merit of the Republic of Hungary for his participation in the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, and he makes his home in the coveted area of Dutchess County, New York. Michael, how are you, my friend?
I am well, thank you.
Well, very pleased to have you here. First of all, let's give our Lewis at Large listeners a little bit more background about you. Tell us about the Order of Merit of the Republic of Hungary for your participation in the Revolution in 56.
Well, I was at Oxford in 1956 in my last year when the Hungarian Revolution broke out, and I and a couple of other people felt, I'm not sure what we felt. I think we felt it was a great moment of history, and that it will be wrong not to go to it or to take part in it. So we got into a Volkswagen and drove to Budapest and arrived in the middle of the fighting. And I spent the next 10 days or 2 weeks in Budapest while the revolution proceeded, and had an opportunity to witness at firsthand what it's like to be in the middle of a violent military event on a large scale, which I guess is not the worst thing in the world. Winston Churchill once said, nothing is more delightful than to be shot at without results.
Yeah, when nothing happens, yeah.
And I feel that to some degree that encapsulates the 20th century experience is that being shot at without result is probably a good thing.
Well, Dunkirk has always been a sort of an iconic line in the stand historically. I know you've been asked this before, but share with our listeners, what was your impression of the recent movie Dunkirk?
I loved it. I thought it was absolutely wonderful. I think it's the best war film I've ever seen. I think it's also a revolutionary breakthrough in how to make a war film. I was astonished because I saw it in the little town of Red Hook, just north of here, in Dutchess County, in New York, and I thought it would be empty, instead of which at 3 p.m. the entire theater was jam-packed full. And at the end of the film, which is only an hour and 46 minutes long, it's not that long, the entire audience stood up and applauded, and half of them were in tears. And I thought to myself, this is really strange, because this is an event in English history 77 years ago. America was not in the war at that time. There are no women in the film, and there's no real story. You were just seeing, with wonderful cinematographic detail and superb sound and photography, you're seeing that event of the war through the eyes of 4 or 5 people who are involved, who never meet each other. There, one is a pilot and one is at sea and so forth. I was just amazed and very moved. I started to cry too, as much because of the audience as because of the film. So Dunkirk has that effect on people, and people who read Alone, which is really for the book. Unlike the movie, Dunkirk is the end of my book, Alone. It's the last chapters of the book. So I really tell the story of the events that led up to Dunkirk, and then Dunkirk itself and the evacuation of the British Army from the beaches at the end of May 1940. It's an enormously emotional event.
Well, let's do this again. If you'd have to be living, I think, either on Mars or under a rock to know about Dunkirk and what happened there. But again, for those that are not aware, would you give us a little bit of a setup about what happened, and then I want to dive into the book.
Well, I think the best way to describe it is that the book begins with the declaration of war, at which time I was only 6 years old. I thread myself through this as a character, but I was a child. In May of 1940, May 10th, 1940, when Hitler attacked Holland, Belgium, and France, and of course the British Army that was in France, the Dutch and the Belgians collapsed on the left of the British Army, and the French attacked on the Meuse where they had not expected to be attacked and were not prepared to be attacked, gave way, and that left the British Army with both its flanks exposed, so that it had no place to go except to retreat north, and the only place it could retreat to was the beach at Dunkirk. So you have to picture 338,000 men on a narrow beach facing the North Sea, apparently either to be bombed and killed or somehow gotten off. And Dunkirk is that critical moment when, in fact, the British went out in their motorboats and yachts and fishing boats and trawlers and everything else that could float, and got that number of men off the beach under fire. An amazing moment in history, and I think a turning point in the war. Had the British Army been captured intact on the beach of Dunkirk, I do not think the war would have gone on, and Hitler would have triumphed, and nasty and brutish as the world is, it would be a much nastier and more brutal place if that had happened.
Indeed. If you just joined us again, yours truly, Warner Lewis, from the flight deck at Lewis at Large, as always, talking to Michael Korda, best-selling author, with an exciting, important new work, I believe, called Alone, Britain, Churchill, and Dunkirk, Defeat into Victory, written from an interesting perspective. Michael, I wanted to follow up real quickly. Let's look at it from another lens. How did, in your opinion, from the military point of view, how did Germany blow it? How did they not make Dunkirk tilt to them?
Well, it's one of the I was going to say climactic, but it's not climactic. But it's one of the most important moments of the book. Is that the older German generals, although they were astonished by the success of the German armored divisions, or as they were referred to, panzer divisions, and the speed with which they moved, they were inordinately worried about the distance opening up between the armored divisions and the infantry divisions, and that they would be counterattacked and separated. Also, they didn't have complete confidence in tanks. Older generals tended to think of the tanks as armored mechanical horses, and so they thought that the tanks needed to be rested. And Hitler himself, while he was conflicted on this subject, was in the position of a gambler who has gone to the roulette table, put down his money on a number, and won. He is now facing the question of whether he leaves the table with all that money or whether he puts all that money on another number and risks losing it all. So he had already won a huge victory against the French, and he was facing a relatively small British army in retreat. The question is, would he risk everything to attack the British at Dunkirk with everything he had in the way of armor? Or would he rest the armor to take the rest of France? And he chose to do the latter. And it was probably the critical mistake of the war. I think it cost Germany the war, and I think it meant eventually that we would win it. And Churchill understood that when he came to the prime ministership on May 10th. He knew that already there were members of the government who were trying to seek out what the German terms for surrender might be, and he was against that, of course. And on the other hand, he wasn't yet in total command of the war cabinet and of his own party, because he'd only recently become prime minister. And he went down to a larger meeting of the full cabinet, which is about 20 or 30 people instead of 9 in the war cabinet. And he made a speech. He had to stand on a desk in a very small room in the back of the House of Commons. And as he ended it, he said, whatever happens, we shall never surrender. We shall fight on, if necessary, for years. If necessary, alone. If this Long Island story of ours is to end, let it end when each of us lies on the floor choking on his own blood. And the entire cabinet cheered him and clapped him on the back. And as he went back to number 10 Downing Street, he was informed that the Navy had gotten 27,000 men off the beach on this first day of Dunkirk. And from both those events, he went back to say that countries who surrendered never came back to their full strength, and that we must not stand upon the slippery slope, and that whatever the French do, we would fight on, and ended all talk of surrender, peace, and negotiations. So it's a critical moment in the war, and a wonderfully dramatic moment in the war that I try and describe in Alone.
One of the things that's unique here is that in the summer of 1940, you are a 6-year-old, and the book offers a perspective about these events and about that time period. Tell us your motivation of doing it from that particular perspective.
Well, I felt that I couldn't leave myself out of it. It's not that I think that my own story is necessarily the point of it at all, but as a child, I remember hearing Neville Chamberlain tell us at 11:15 in the morning on September 3rd on the wireless, as we call it in England, on the radio. We all sat around the radio and heard the Prime Minister tell us that Great Britain was now at war with Germany again. And I remember hearing Churchill's first speeches, sitting around the radio, and even though I was 6 when we declared war and 7 when Dunkirk occurred, I could tell from the seriousness of the grown-ups around me that these were great events taking place, and they were explained to me. So they are to some degree burned in my mind. In addition to which, the British government had a long-standing plan to evacuate 2,500,000 children from London and the cities in the south of England, because it was assumed that the Germans would begin the war with a tremendous bombardment, including poison gas, and that hundreds of thousands of people would be killed, which didn't happen. But they were prepared for it. Everybody says the British were unprepared. They were actually prepared for the worst. The government had made hundreds of thousands of cardboard coffins and stored them in places all over London. We were all issued with gas masks. I remember mine very distinctly. Millions and millions of pre-printed death certificates had been printed up and distributed to local authorities. And so 2,500,000 children were evacuated to places in the north of England, myself included. And you know, when you say those words, it's hard to picture what it looks like to see 2,500,000 children getting on trains to go basically nowhere without their parents. So my story is woven through much more important and bigger stories to give a kind of elasticity and day-to-day chronology to the events, so that they're linked together. I try and show what was happening in Britain, what was happening in Paris, what was happening in Berlin, what was happening in the field and in the fighting. But I try and bind it together so that Alone is a single story, but at the same time good history.
You describe in quite a bit of detail Neville Chamberlain and as well as Churchill, and describing Churchill as the rarest of men, a well-functioning, even hyper-functioning alcoholic. Tell us about Churchill, not only from your research, but your memories also from there. And what do we not know about him we need to know? And are there any misconceptions, do you think, about him?
Well, I think there's a misconception. I actually feel slightly guilty for having used the word alcoholic. He was not an alcoholic; he was a heavy drinker, and there is a difference between the two things. He drank a weak whiskey and scotch and water at moments when most other people would have had a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, and he certainly drank heavily. But as he said later in life, he said, "In a long life, I have taken more out of alcohol than alcohol has taken out of me." Which I think is, first of all, a wonderful remark and true, and to which I think I can probably ally myself. I feel I've gotten more out of alcohol over my life than alcohol has gotten out of me. I knew him. He actually worked for my uncle Alexander Korda, the film producer, during the 30s, when he needed money to keep the very expensive Churchill ship afloat, because no matter how much money was coming in, Churchill always spent the same amount, which was considerable. And he and my uncle were close friends. So as a boy, I remember meeting him several times, and I went to school with his grandson, who became a very close friend of mine later in my life. So I'm writing about Churchill not just in terms of the history and the papers and the documents, but from having known him and the other members of his family. Admittedly, much of that time I was a child, and therefore I didn't sit down and have long conversations with him. But I knew him well enough to create him, I think, in this book as a much more complex and interesting figure than he is when you usually read about him.
My sense is that people don't like talking about this gentleman, but gentleman is a compliment. But let's talk about Adolf Hitler, and I'd be very curious, again, from your perspective as a historian and someone that lived it, what was your impression of him? Evil, yes, but beyond that, take us into that mind, into that mindset, and into that personality.
Well, I think, first of all, your listeners should understand, first of all, that I was a child during that period, and secondly, of course, that I never met Adolf Hitler. On the other hand, I knew an awful lot of people who had met Adolf Hitler during the days when that was possible. I think that, and I explore this in Alone, I think that when it comes to the military side of Nazism, that Hitler paid a price for having killed himself in April 1945 because most of his generals, with the exception of those who committed suicide, like Rommel, lived to write their memoirs. And when they wrote their memoirs, everything that went wrong with the Second World War, they blamed on Hitler. So that Hitler, for example, gets the blame for the decision to have the German armored divisions rest and repair their tanks for 2 days in May of 1940, which effectively meant that they were not able to attack the beaches and decimate the British Army on the spot because they were busy servicing their tanks, which didn't need servicing. But the truth of the matter is that Hitler was giving in somewhat reluctantly to the advice of his own generals, which was that the tanks needed to be serviced and rested for 2 days. And so you have to read the history very carefully and very selectively, because everybody who survived put every mistake on Hitler, and that's, from the military point of view, not strictly speaking true. Of course, from the political side of things, then yes, Hitler's responsibility is 100% and clear-cut. What he wanted, he did, and what he wanted was evil and even preposterously evil, and will always stand out as virtually the most politically evil act ever performed by anybody or by any nation. But writing history about him, one of the things you learn is that there's a very complex and shrewd political mind there together with, of course, a very, very ferocious psychology and an ironclad determination to have his own way. Some attention should be paid to that, because I'm not so sure that anybody reading alone might not conclude from it that it is a mistake to exchange insults with any foreign leader. It is better to approach diplomacy and have behind it a strength and determination to use forces, if necessary, to which the other person will pay attention. We neglected to do that in the 30s, and that was a great mistake, because it led Hitler to the conclusion that Britain wouldn't fight, and he was wrong. And I think that's always a mistake. Winston Churchill said, it is better to draw than to war.
Again, if you just joined us, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large, talking about a brand new work called Alone, Britain, Churchill, and Dunkirk, Defeat into Victory, by historian and author Michael Korda. He is former editor-in-chief of Simon & Schuster and was awarded the Order of Merit of the Republic of Hungary for his participation in the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, and he is absolutely the first Order of Merit winner that we've ever had on this show, and pleased to have him. Michael, you touched on it earlier. Let's talk about Operation Pied Piper. You, along with 3.5 million other kids, taken out of London, taken out of major UK cities, and taken to safety. Tell us about that, and how did you rejoin your family, or were you fully separated from them, or tell us about that?
I was separated from them several times because I was sent here and there, along with, as I say, a flood tide of other bewildered children, all of us with a piece of cardboard on a string around our neck with our name on it, and a gas mask. And eventually I rejoined my family in England, and then towards the end of the year, was once again evacuated, this time with 600 children on board a boat to Canada. Another last gasp of the British evacuation scheme of children. That was an unforgettable event, because I happen to have an ironclad stomach. I never get seasick. I have no idea where that should be, but there it is. I don't get seasick. But the other 500 got seasick for about 14 days across the Atlantic, so it remains a burning memory in my mind. But, the book is not really so much about my childhood as using my childhood as a means of showing the events, the people involved, and also of comparing what we now know with what we then knew. Another major historical task is to compare what was really going on with what we thought was going on.
Did you have the opportunity, either as wouldn't be part probably of this research, but through the course of your life and the various travels that you've done, did you have the opportunity to meet ever anyone that was part of the German military hierarchy at all, and also their English counterparts?
Oh yeah, I did, as a matter of fact, because I was the editor for Cornelius Ryan's The Longest Day. I was Connie Ryan's editor, and my father was the art director for the major multi-star movie that was made of The Longest Day. And at that time, my father took me along. We got to meet a number of German generals. When I was actually in the Royal Air Force, I was in Germany for some time. This would have been in the 1950s, and had dealt with a lot of people who had been in the German Army or the German Air Force during the Second World War. So none of that is I was going to say none of that is foreign to me. Of course, it is foreign because it's German and I'm English and American. But I'm familiar with a lot of that, and I try to approach all of that with some form of balance. I want to give the German appreciation of what was going on and the decisions that they made in a calm and objective way, just as I do the French and the British and everybody else. Underlying that is that in the Second World War as in the First. The Germans were our enemy. But I try to present in Alone, if not a balanced picture, a fully three-dimensional picture of everything that was going on. So it's not just one-sided.
Well, as we start to wind down here, Michael, I would like to get your take, as a lot has been written and said and documented about Dunkirk, and much more undoubtedly will in the future. But from your perspective, from the perspective of the work Alone, what is, in your opinion, the real takeaway here? What's the lesson, or what's sort of the reflection or the headline here for you?
Well, I think there are two. The first is that you should never give in to a dictatorship or to threats, something which we should have had in mind in the 30s. And the second is that in times of great emergency and crises, ordinary people come out and do extraordinary things, and Dunkirk is one example of that. That it's comparable to watching, except on a larger and much more deadly scale, what ordinary people did in Houston and are probably doing at the moment in Puerto Rico. They are doing acts of great heroism, spontaneously and without a view to their own self-interest or their own life. And Dunkirk is one of the moments in history when ordinary people, in effect, saved us from defeat by getting into their small boats and going across the channel through minefields, despite the fact that they were being bombed and shelled, and picking up men on the beach and bringing them home. That's an extraordinary thing in history. It's something that's very moving and very significant. I think it should give us hope for the future.
Well, it is a fascinating work, an important and definitive one called Alone, Britain, Churchill, and Dunkirk, Defeat into Victory by Michael Korda. Michael, probably most people know, but how can people pick up a copy of the book and also find out a little bit more about some of the other writings that you've done?
Well, I've written biographies of Robert E. Lee, Lawrence of Arabia, T. Lawrence, and Dwight D. Eisenhower. And a book about the Battle of Britain in June of 1940, the Royal Air Force victory over the German Luftwaffe in July, August, and September of 1940, another very significant event in the Second World War. And before that, I've written a number of novels. At one time, I thought that I was going to write a lot of novels, and I did write some. And then I discovered midway through writing novels, I had one huge success with a novel called Queenie, which was a #1 bestseller and made into a major miniseries. But I discovered what I really wanted to do was pursue history, and that's what I've been doing. I started doing that with the biography of General Ulysses S. Grant, and I've moved on from there to do quite a lot of history and biography, and I hope to continue.
Well, thank you again so much for sharing your thoughts, and would love to have you back on again.
I would love to do that too.
Sounds good. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.